the cloud. You'll have to agree to the recording and welcome to all those who are online and those who are joining us in person and those who are joining us on YouTube. So as you read through this chapter, what struck you? What was something that you were surprised about, maybe read for the first time?
The first sentence, in the spring at the time when kings go off to war. Is that every
Is that a
spring
thing?
they go off to war?
The time when the kings go off to war. Why would they go off to war in the spring?
Well, the weather's nicer, but still.
They want the good land to be able to raise their crops.
There's a lot of reasons to fight in the spring, and it's harder in the fall. You're not reaping a harvest. It's not the winter time, which is
Days are longer.
really challenging. In summer, it's hot. And if you win places in the spring, you get their harvest the next year, right? So it was a natural time when wars would occur. Kings would ready themselves through the winter, and then off to war they would go to
So like
expand
an
their.
annual thing?
Yep.
Nice.
Yep.
Yeah, I've heard about trees.
Yep. What else?
Seems to be only always about taking and conquering. And that's what happened with Bathsheba, that's what happened with all the wars.
On lots of levels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was surprised I had forgotten about how devious David was, but you're right, I was reminded.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot packed into that story. It's not just as simple as what we might remember, right? How about online? Anyone want to jump in here?
I think it was unfortunate for Bathsheba whether she could say no,
Yeah.
because the way I guess because he's the king, could she have said no? I don't know. I guess maybe because the king asks, you have to go. I don't know.
Right.
So
Oftentimes not covered in this is the role that Bathsheba plays. It's often a story that's told from the lens of David. But here you have Bathsheba, who does what she was following the Levitical code of cleansing herself after her time, her period. And so she was doing kind of the right thing. The king asks for her to come, she comes, and then there's no offering of consent in this story, in the story or in the biblical text as you read through it as well. There isn't a sense that Bathsheba says that that's okay. And so we could determine this again as a form of rape and violence towards women in the scriptures. It's something to be aware of, right? Because in this setting, we aren't doing the Me Too movement as much anymore. You're not hearing about it as much as it was, but it's that same notion of the king or said powerful person using their power and influence to be able to, in this case, have sex, but it could be a number of things, but using their power and influence for violence against women, right? And that's what's happening in this story. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah. What about Uriah, the husband? He was trying to do everything right.
Again,
He didn't want to take advantage of coming back while everybody else was fighting, so he didn't go home.
Yeah,
And what did he get? He got killed for it.
Yeah.
So he was trying to do what's right all that time.
he's not rewarded at all.
No, not at all.
Although what, some could say that David isn't rewarded really either, right?
Yeah,
His,
for that, right.
his life pretty much goes downhill after this. I mean, it doesn't get any better. Right?
And he doesn't get to build the tower.
He was never going to, right? And that's in 2 Samuel 7, there's a, God talks about building a house. But if you remember, we talked about this before, there's an ark of Saul, and then there's the ark of David, right? And, you know, his pinnacle was before Bathsheba. Bathsheba was kind of on his down. And the rest of his life just falls apart, kind of after this. He has kids, and, you know, he still maintains his place, but they rise up against him. You know, his kingdom is falling apart.
There's another woman in the story too, his other wife,
Mhm.
Michal,
Yeah,
and she's the daughter of Saul.
yeah,
And she really is sarcastic. Page 158.
yeah, that's the, yeah, last chapter.
Yeah.
She did not like that he was dancing with her.
King has
the slave.
distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as that knee vulgar fellow would. That's pretty strong statement for a woman at that time.
Yep,
Right?
no, yep, she has a,
And God punishes her.
she has a strong personality.
But she's punished for doing that. Because she has no children.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm confused on page 167,
uh-huh,
last full paragraph. Says David's army marched out of the city to fight Israel. I thought they were Israel.
Yeah, that's.
And the battle took place in the fourth, that Israel's troops were routed by David's men.
right. So there's a couple theories on as you start to see this sort of break apart, right? So when this was written down, it could have been written down by, so we'll have this chapter, and then we're gonna have another chapter where it deals with Solomon, and then you're gonna have another chapter where it's the kingdom torn in two, and that's where we're gonna end. It's actually kind of appropriate, where the kings, that's when we get into the book of Kings. The northern kingdom is Israel, and the southern kingdom is Judah. Israel ends up getting demolished by the Assyrian Empire, right? And they have no good kings. And so the northern kingdom, which has a whole lot of problems, sometimes can be denoted in other parts of the scriptures as Israel. So David's going off to fight Israel, the breakoff kingdom, right? The section of people that didn't want, because eventually, right, it'll be Solomon's kids, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and they split, right? And it's like a foreshadowing of that. But also, you could say in the Civil War, we talked about the North and the South, but they were still fighting Americans, right? So if you want to focus on it in that way, it's that they were still fighting one another. They were identifying each other as the blue coats and gray coats, right? But ultimately, if we were going to talk about it as a civil war, it's still, you're fighting your own nation. It's an infighting that's happening. And what could be being denoted here is that they weren't fighting another group that had been, Absalom had like taken control of, or like said, hey, Midianites, come in here, you help me fight, and then we'll split up some of this land or something like that, right? It's kind of a note to saying like, no, Israel's still fighting against Israel. That's civil war, sort of. So there's kind of two ways when that, and it pops up in other locations too. So it's not just here, where all of a sudden you'll see them identified, or a group of them identified as Israel, and it doesn't make as much sense. So that's kind of the idea around why that might have happened. At least that's how it's been explained to me.
Is there a story or explanation for why Absalom turned against his father?
Kids, I don't know.
There's in another book. I'm seeing you with it, but yesterday we talked about that. And there was some information about a daughter of David was raped by a brother.
Yep.
And he didn't do anything about it. And
Yep.
made Absalom so mad,
Yep.
absolutely furious. And it just turned him against his father.
Yeah. Yep, and that's so the story does a nice job of kind of keeping, I mean, it gets into the spaces that are well known, like it can't slide over David and Bathsheba, right? But the struggle here is that it can't give you the entire narrative. It's not formatted for that. So one thing I'll just note, and then we'll get into it more, but if you ever are asking those questions, remember the chart of references is in the back here. And then what you should do is kind of go in the back, read where that might be, and then go into the scriptures and do this. Now, this isn't the first time of rape happening within a family system and then throwing that system into absolute chaos. Remember the rape of Dinah that happened with the brothers in this Joseph story, right? Now, again, that was not covered in the story, and some could say it probably shouldn't be. Like the story isn't the 12 worst stories in the Bible or something like that, right? It's like this supposed to be this overarching narrative to get you kind of a base level to set on that. But the reality is, how does and one of the great scholarships that's like just now emerging is this trauma research and theory in the biblical text. How do families deal with trauma when it happens in their families, right? Because the reality is that trauma happens in all sorts of ways in our families. Death, disease, rape, abuse, neglect, all these sorts of things happen within families. And then how does a family act and interact when that happens in its family system? And here we think that for some reason we have it painted in the Bible that like they have unicorns and rainbows and everything turns out okay. The reality is that that's not true, that there's infighting and anger, and that anger then boils over, and instead of dealing with resolution, they try to kill each other, which seems like a form of resolution, but not a healthy form of resolution. That's,
Takes the problem away.
it does solve the issue.
You'll never do that again.
Quite literally, you never do that again, right? Absalom, and you know these people, they're zealous in your family system. They have an idea of what's right and what's wrong, and they will not back down from that. There's a warning, like in the story of Absalom, there's a warning about that. And there's also a warning to David. I mean, it's not just a one-sided, there's not a right answer. These are murky and muddy situations. And the reality is they need to be talked about openly, often, and with care. And there needs to be more that's done, right? I think the warnings that go out from these are when you come down with a hard or iron fist, it doesn't end up helping the situation. It may end it in that moment, but it doesn't solve it. And so when it comes to Absalom and David and that situation, you wanna read the text to understand that there are consequences in that situation. And sometimes in situations of trauma, reading about situations of trauma, or like people talk about like watching it, or I was just over at the assisted living at Dublin Retirement Village, And they're now doing these VR sessions for caregivers and people with, and children to help others understand what it's like to live with dementia or what it's like to live with different things. So you virtual reality, you're brought into a space and place that it will mimic something like that. And all of these stories help us to learn if we read them, and we can use them as learning tools for us. But they tend not to. But that's why. And then I don't know if you had some sort of like giant fro or how your hair gets caught in the tree.
Right.
I've always thought that was like a comical piece of the story. Like, what do you got going on
They
that?
seem to not cut men's hair if they were dedicated to God. So if they did have a lot of hair, trust me, it would not be that difficult to get caught in a tree.
But to be hung in the tree, I don't know. Anyway, don't get caught up on that piece of the story, like how is your hair getting caught in the story. That's the type of stuff that will lead you down these rabbit holes that have no real meaning or purpose.
And it just every story just shows how much we need a savior.
Right. Yeah, and how broken even the line of Jesus's family tree was, right? So you can talk about Absalom, but also going back to David, Bathsheba, and Uriah, that's a similar thing. So in confirmation, we talked about what does it mean to be in a healthy relationship, right? But somebody who has power should not force you to do anything. And you shouldn't be in those situations. And if you are in those situations, you need to find somebody to help you get out of those situations. Then there's the relationship that David has with Nathan, right? Which is unique. And we had them think about who are their Nathans in their lives, right? Who is that person in your life that can come alongside of you and in a loving and kind way, because he does it by telling the story. He doesn't shame and blame like my mom. I mean, other people in our family might do. He doesn't shame or blame or just like yell at him and scream and throw stuff around, right? He finds a kind way. Nathan is a prophet of the Lord. He finds a way and he tells a story. He illustrates the same story, and David's righteous indignation comes forth, and then Nathan says, "You're the one that's taken the lamb." And when somebody tells you a truth, it can be hard, right? It can be super hard because they name something that's real in our life. They name something that we are maybe off a track, that doesn't represent who we are or who God wants us to be. They're naming things, and yet, and what maybe even for whatever reason, our society or we tried to distance ourselves then, call that person a name and then, don't call them back again. Because I don't want to hear it type of thing. And so, but the biblical text here is important to say, you need a Nathan. You need somebody in your life that's going to call out the times in your life when you're not either making sense or you're doing activities, you've gotten yourself into a crowd of people that is not helpful. When we're talking about confirmation, like you're doing things that don't represent kind of who you are, and you need somebody to call you back and say, that's not who you are. And think about why you're doing this and what are you trying to get out of, going to this party or being in, this type of friend group. Like, what are you longing for that's not there, right? And so the encouragement is to find and to nurture that relationship and to even give permission to somebody to say, like, it's okay to be a Nathan in my life. Somebody who says it like it is, kind of thing.
I think popular culture, as far as David is concerned, Popular culture turned Bathsheba into a temptress to try to take the blame off of him.
Oh, yeah.
And that says a whole lot about the patriarchy and the way women were dealt with and viewed.
Are dealt with, yeah.
Did women have the right to say no? I mean, I wonder, because I didn't live 2,000 years ago.
I don't know if she did or not, in this circumstance, probably really challenging. You've personally been in situations where each of us has, where really somebody who's more powerful than us has come in. And because we want to make them happy, or we say or do things or go along with or laugh at the jokes that are not funny type of thing. And I think that's more of the conversation to have around power and influence. Whether or not it was okay at the time doesn't necessarily translate to whether or not,
But the question keeps coming up, why didn't she say no? And I'm like, did
But at
women?
the end here, we talk about, at the end, she tells him, it's time for him to step down.
yeah,
And she listens or he listens and he does.
yeah.
So in a way, I mean,
Well, she's positioning Solomon.
right, but I'm just saying at the beginning, she was taken advantage of, and then here at the end, she's speaking to him and saying, it's time for you to step down, and he does. And I think about, in our normal situation, in our life, older as we are, that we deal with all kinds of situations too, that I think are hard. Like we're dealing with my in-laws, and they don't want to hear what we have to say to them because they don't, they can't take care of themselves anymore.
Yeah.
And it is a battle, and it gets ugly.
Mhm.
It has been very ugly. And I don't know what to do. I mean, my husband and I talk about it all the time, and we're not in town. They live in Montana. So it's hard for us, but
Yeah.
as our age, and then I think, I'm not gonna act like that when I'm their age, but then I think, well, you better not talk like that, because you never know what you're gonna be like. I mean, really, I think it's hard. I don't know what to do. It's a struggle.
Well, there's two things to that. One, there's a generational gap that's happening that never happened before. I mean, people are living well beyond the years that they ever have before now. And so this is a new frontier of you dealing with a generation that is older in that sense, right? And you will have learned, and you can change the system as it moves down, right?
I'm hoping.
In theory.
I mean, that's.
But the other piece is there's a whole lot of brain chemistry stuff that's out there that just talks about how we as people change. I was talking to my in-laws about this. I was joking with my father-in-law, saying, is there a code word that we could train you in now that I could just say when you become senile that you will listen? Like, if I say pink elephants are flying, will you just stop and listen? Can we just work on that now? 'Cause that would be nice. 'Cause that would be the case.
He said, sure.
So I probably wouldn't remember it anyway. So.
What great.
He said best thing to do would be say something and then give me a treat. And I'll associate that word with something good's gonna happen, and then. But yeah, you think about generationally how this has impact. What does it look like? And then you think about how trauma is dealt with, and what kids are told or not told, and how they get the opportunity to process through stuff. We have that going on as well. And it's different people at different times in different situations, right? But we all work through that.
I think I'm just really impressed, and have always been, with the songs that David writes and how helpful they are
Mhm.
when you read them, and you can kind of find something to help you with whatever happening at that time. Reading the Psalms is really helpful, I think.
Yeah. yeah, it's David is lifted up over and over again by the way that he does all these different things. He can kill Goliath, but write poetry. I mean, you know, but it's not that he is by any means a perfect person. He has lots of failures and faults.
And he wrote about them.
And he writes about them, or he collected them,
Right.
one of the two, that spoke to where his heart was. Anyway, yeah, and then we'll have the classic: first generation builds the business, second generation manages the business, third generation loses the business. We're on generation 3 when we enter into Solomon in this motion, because he will manage the business and then his kids will lose it. So David built it, kind of solved it, but and he'll manage it, he'll grow it, it's gonna be great, but he grows it by idol worship and all this other stuff, marrying everybody. I mean, every king around him who has a daughter gets married to Solomon, so he grows the kingdom in that way, and then but then you know, anyway, so yeah, the Psalms are beautiful though. David, there are a couple here that of course lift up both sin and you know, we have Psalm 51 is the first one that we have on page 163. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great, blot out my transgressions. Right? Wash away from me all my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin. You hear David or the psalmist just penning out this sense of being broken. And it's the Psalms can be words for when we have emotions but don't have words, like when we're feeling something but are unable to exactly say what we're feeling. Sometimes the Psalms, one of the great roles that they can have is that they can be those words for you. So if you're feeling like you need to get forgiveness, receive forgiveness, you've done something really not very nice, this can be the words that you pray.
The end of 51, when
Yeah.
I was growing up, that used to always be our offertory.
Restore to me the joy of salvation. Hold me with your spirit.
So when David refers to the Holy Spirit, and I know we talked about this in Psalms, and we've talked about this before, but in the little footnote at the bottom, it refers to the Holy Spirit that we understand as being given by Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
So
That's a Christian way of viewing it, right? So our understanding is a Trinity formula for God, right? God is 1 and 3 and 3 and 1, right? You got that. Without having the actual Hebrew here and looking at it, my hunch is that that's a translation of Holy Spirit. Not maybe the word there. I'd be curious what word that. Take your Holy Spirit from me.
I would think, didn't he have visits from God telling him what to do? And
Yeah.
to me, he's referring
So
to
often-
those visits, don't leave me.
Yeah, oftentimes I would say that Nathan played that role of the, so less so David actually like Moses, having conversation with God. And more so we see now the prophets will be the messengers of God. Those who are are intentionally placed in the role to say what God has to say in this world.
Why do you think there was that change that God spoke at one time and then distanced himself through another vehicle? Or maybe it wasn't distancing, but used another tool.
Yeah,
to speak.
it's a good question because God's presence shifts, right? From that kind of the direct person or the person that we were, how do you put it? Like Moses now, but God continues to speak, but God continues to speak in a new way, right? So now we have prophets. I don't know why exactly, other than when the introduction of kings happened, we then move to God not speaking to the kings, and God uses the prophets. So in prophetic voice conversation, we talk about this, and modern culture has said, oh, you're a prophet. And there's a couple problems with that. One, sometimes we say that when we're talking about like fortune tellers. The prophets were not fortune tellers. They were obvious sayers, right? Like they had been given a message from God, not like they were not like crystal balling it, right? They knew what was going to happen because God told them what was going to happen. Or they saw around them, hey, you're all breaking the covenants. Look, just look. They were doing the Nathan thing. They were naming the thing that was right there. Prophet also tends to speak when the kings are around. So we have talked about having prophets, modern day prophets. But the problem is that while we have people elected in government, it's not in that same sort of way. And the prophet really was a role to speak to the king and to the people, right? But as soon as we get, out of the Holy Land, we start to see angels that come and speak to Joshua, and then they come and speak to the judges, right? And then we move from angels into prophets. I don't know why that is, but it's the way that, and it could just be illustrated that God speaks in lots of different ways.
What about today?
So how we understand God speaking today is the scriptures. As Jesus came, right, in the flesh and incarnate, God switched from being a God that offered revelation to a particular situation, and instead uses revelation through the scriptures to speak to us in our lives. Sometimes that happens in ways like that the Holy Spirit, it's always interesting whenever you preach, because sometimes when you preach something and people will be like, I really liked it when you said this. It's like, I didn't say that. And I can go back on the tape now and say, like, I didn't say that. That wasn't, something that I was even talking about. And that happens a lot more often than you would think. Different congregations, kind of remark on sermons differently. Some will talk to you the day of, some write to you, some will do kind of a mixture of both, right? This congregation does a lot of writing. I get a lot of emails about sermons after, at least for me. I don't get a ton of people don't, like in Georgia, it would be like they would comment on a piece of my sermon, like right as they're walking out the door type of thing. And that would be very common. Here, it's more like, hey, this is a part of the sermon that really spoke to me, or my family and I talked about this, and we had another question about it, or something along that line, right? Or you're a false prophet. No, I don't get that. But in that way, the way that I think that God speaks is through the community, it's through the word, and just revelation that happened. God has spoken in a new way when Christ comes. It changes. Again, as we're building all of this, there's a culmination for us as Christians that happens. We call it Christmas, but ultimately Easter. And that it's a changing of the whole nature. And hopefully, my hope is that as long as we can keep dragging you through the Old Testament, you will get to that spot and it will seem anew as you read the New Testament. There's gonna be, you're gonna see things in a different light as you read through it. It will feel differently. And it gets tough because at a certain point in the time, people are like, I don't wanna keep reading the Old Testament. Let's just go. Let's move on. I'm done. Let's go on to chapter, whatever it is. And no, keep with it because it continues. The narrative will continue now. The kingdoms get broken and then there's an exile that happens and the prophets will speak in the midst of that. That all has importance into the narrative.
And it's all juicy reading.
Yeah, Game of Thrones thinks that they have the story. Actually, I know this firsthand because Rachel was asked to participate in it. They are creating a major a series on the life of David. And it's going to be several seasons they're hoping for. And it will be Rachel ended up not participating or pulling back from it because they're going to it's not going to be completely biblically oriented. They're going to do it kind of like a mixture of Bible and Game of Thrones. And so they'll use the storyline of David, but they're going to add more different things. And so they wanted other aspects that would have happened in the Near East that could happen, but aren't in the scriptures. The problem with that is that's everything Rachel works against in her teaching is people, instead of creating scripture, which people love to do, right? To especially fit a need or something like that. You're supposed to be listening to what the scriptures are actually saying, interpreting that, not the other way around. So she pulled back from it, but I know the project's moving forward, and it's by a major place, and it will probably come through the cycle at some point in time. Because it's a pretty good story. You start with killing giants and you've got adultery and you've got, you got sons, if the nation is obsessed with Game of Thrones, which I have not actually seen, but it swept across the nation. And if the nation is obsessed with that, they will love this story. My thought on it is, hey, if it gets anybody to actually read the scriptures, maybe we should go forward with it. Like,
How far is too far?
yeah, that was the conversation in our household. But it's one of the reasons why people are hesitant about doing the story in general is that,
Yes,
it cherry picks the scriptures.
Yes.
But the other piece is that at least we're in the scriptures. At least people are reading things sometimes for the first time, but a lot of times just again, it's been a long time, or they haven't read it in such a way that they're getting the arc to remember some of the other stories. So anyway.
It's always good to reread.
They could do it like Star Wars and say they started at number 4 and then they want to go back and pick up juicy stuff from before.
We're going to be doing this chapter or this book in confirmation every 3 years. So we'll be repeating it every 3 years. It'll be our Bible.
Repeat.
Because we have 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. So this will be one of the years. Then we'll do Lutheran Catechism one of the years. And then I'm still developing the 3rd year, but I think our 3rd year is going to be like a world religions kind of class, where you learn about other religions because they go to school with so many kids that are from other places and understand. And instead of, so we're going to try to do it in a way that we actually bring in their leaders, so gurus and imams and rabbis, rather than having kids try to explain it to kids, because then you get all this goofy stuff that it doesn't actually, they don't actually believe, or anyway.
It'd be nice to have adults study in parallel. It was.
Yeah.
I had comparative religions in college, and it's very good.
Yeah, I think it's really, really helpful. And it shouldn't really be something that we're super afraid of. It should be something that we look into and think more deeply about. But it's that year is going to be a lot harder to develop. But I think I can do it.
You can do it.
I think, or there isn't anything out there that I can just lean into that would make it easier. So it's going to be a lot of weeks of.
But over the years, there have been people here that have developed relationships with some of those different places here around town. And we've had people come in and talk, so you've got people here that you could lean on.
Yeah, honestly, most of, the other pieces, I thought about doing it world religions, but also like Christianity. Like maybe we either start with one or the other. I don't know which one blends better to each other, but then bringing in the Monsignor to talk about the Catholic faith, bringing in the Methodist pastor to talk about what that means, or the Reformed Presbyterians, or whichever it might be, so that we can have a little bit deeper of an understanding when we're passing other churches, what they
stand.
how they're a little different than who we are. So.
But if you look at the Reformation, there was a lot that happened that you could tie together in like a 6-week study, and what was going on in England and how it ended up over.
Yeah. So when the Monsignor shows up, we have torches and pitchforks. Or?
Yeah. What do you think? That's a good idea.
All right. Well, the study for the day, and we move on next week. We hear about Solomon, and then the kingdom's torn in two, and we can do tug of war too if you want to. And confirmation, that's what we're gonna do. So you feel right. Find the rope. All right. Blessings.
I want to know how they use that new pit